Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Hubbard. I'm the Deputy Chief of Police with the Crystal Police Department, and it is snowing heavy outside, and we are coming to you virtually today to share some information with you. We are doing a level 3 predatory offender notification, and we're doing it really because we want to just make sure that the community is informed about what's happening in the community. The statute does require some notification, and so we want to cover that. But more importantly, we just want to make sure that everybody knows the various safeguards that we make to make sure that these go smoothly and that everybody remains safe in their homes and in their communities. And so to help us with that, we've got Brad Vandervet from the state of Minnesota, Department of Corrections here. And I'm going to turn the floor over to him to give some information at the end of this. Brad will have, obviously, because we're doing this virtually, we don't have much space for interaction and questions, but certainly we want to take anybody's questions or concerns that anybody has. At the end of the presentation, Brad will share contact info for himself as well as the police department. And I will encourage you at the front end as you're watching this, if you have those questions, go ahead and scribble them down and reach out so that we can make sure there's no secrets here and that you have all the information that we're able to give you. So with that, Brad, I'll turn the floor over to you and let you have at it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deputy Chief. And thank you all for taking the time to review this important information. As you heard, my name is Brad Vandervet, and I am with the Minnesota Department of Corrections, and I serve within the Risk Assessment and Community Notification Unit. And so this brings me into close proximity with a lot of the various working components within our state's broader risk management system as it relates to those who engage in this type of harm. And so my information today is going to really kind of come to you in three very distinct parts, because we found over the years that many of the questions that no doubt you're having can be addressed with some of these preliminary conversations on how the registry works, how notification works, and how risk levels are assessed and assigned. And then I will use that information as kind of an overlay as we get into the specifics about the man you're here to learn about today. And then I will wrap up with some additional resources as you go on to implement this information into your family and broader community safety planning efforts. So without further ado, where I think it makes the most sense to begin in a conversation like this is with what we know as communities. And that is that those who engage in this type of harm, sexual harm, they exist. And we understand that they exist within all areas of society, and they cross all various designations from socioeconomic status to race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, and so on. And so really the question then comes down to, what is it that we as various state agencies and systems, what are we doing as we become aware of those who engage in this type of harm? And one of those first important components, one of the pillars of that broader risk management system that's come online is the registry. Originally known as the Sex Offender Registry, it began in the early 90s, in 1991, and it was really founded on that understanding, or actually, I'm sorry, on the advocacy of the Wetterling family and others after the abduction of their son, Jacob, where they went around to law enforcement within the state and beyond and asked the important question of what more can we do to ensure that the information is collected on these particular individuals. And at the time, we were really focusing on adult males that targeted minors, so that those law enforcement agencies have that information at their fingertips as quickly and readily as possible. And law enforcement really resoundingly said, what we need is a system that collates all of our data and information. And so the registry was born of that, and allows law enforcement to attain and share information very rapidly. Over the years, the registry has kind of grown to include not just those adult male sex offenders that target children, but all who are involved in sex offending crime. And the name had to change because we actually included additional non-sex specific conduct as well. And I'll share that with you in a moment. But the registry collects and maintains a great deal of information about those subject to it, from their address, their primary address, to any secondary addresses, places they may frequent. Think places like a significant other's home or a family member, if they're visiting, like I say, with any real frequency, will be listed as a secondary address. They also must register their place of employment. And if they're operating a motor vehicle for that employer, they must make that information known as well. Any schools that they're attending, whether virtual and online or otherwise, must be known to law enforcement. And any vehicles that they themselves either use, own, or possess must be made known to law enforcement. In addition to this, there's other information collected for the database, such as scars, marks, and tattoos, photo representation, and any place that they may rent, like a storage unit, and things like that, phone numbers, and so on. So you can see the robust information that law enforcement has at their fingertips should the need arise to whittle down a list of potential persons of interest. So I'd mentioned that the registry has kind of grown and changed over the years to include non-sex specific crimes. And you can see here that those crimes are kidnapping and false imprisonment. And this required a name change. So the registry's changed from the sex offender registry to the predatory offender registry, because as you can see, not all registered individuals are sex offenders. And so an easy way to keep it straight in your mind as I go forward today is that all registered individuals for sex crimes are considered predatory offenders, while not all registrants are sex offenders. And so hopefully that kind of helps just kind of keep it straight. As I get to share a little bit more information in meetings like this to kind of help you get your mind around just what the registry is and how this all works, I can share with you kind of a 30,000-foot flyover view of what's going on in our state. And so as you're looking at this information, I want to put in your mind the analogy of a funnel. And I want you to think at that widest end of that funnel are those sex crimes that occur. And from what we know, from all of our data and research and study, and there is a robust amount of data and research out there, is that the majority of crimes of this nature go unreported. And that funnel already begins to narrow. Of those that do get reported, only a portion of those will go on to receive formal charges, and we narrow yet again. And of those charged, only a portion of that group may go on to receive a conviction, and we narrow yet again. And of those convicted, only a portion of that group may go on to enter a prison system, crossing the threshold of a prison. And I'll explain here coming up why that's a unique distinction. But by the time we get to where we are here on this screen, we are already well down the neck of that funnel, to the point where at the first of this year, we had about approximately 18,288 registered persons in our database. That's all of them. That's those with no risk level assigned and all the way up and through risk level 3. If I narrow in that snapshot to just a couple days ago, or February 21st here, so just a day ago, and this shows those primary residences, not secondary residences. But of that 18,288, you can see 2,860 were reporting primary residence within Hennepin County. That smaller number to the right there, that 150, are those subject to broad public notification. Those are the folks we get to share more information on. And so you can see this narrowing effect. If you look at the city of Crystal proper at the time that I ran these numbers, and do bear in mind, these numbers are dynamic. They are fluctuating and changing very, very frequently, because these individuals do move with some regularity. But at that moment, when I took the snapshot, there were 58 of that 2,860 that reported primary residence within the city of Crystal proper. And 2 of those individuals, one of whom is the man you're here to learn about, are those individuals subject to broad notification. And you can look at neighboring communities and see how their numbers break down. The bottom line is there is no community in Minnesota or beyond where these individuals, registered persons, either don't directly live or frequent. And so we want that awareness to be broad, because if we just focus in on those, the two here in Crystal that we get to talk about, we're missing that bigger picture. And that's really the takeaway from this information. Another big component of that broader state risk management system that I've been discussing came online a number of years after the registry, and it's known as the Community Notification Act. It was spurred by the federal legislation known as Megan's Law, and is really predicated on the understanding and knowledge that a well-informed community is a safer community. And we in the Department of Corrections commend and thank the City of Crystal and its police department for all of its efforts to ensure that this information is received by as many people as possible, because we do know that it matters. Often a feeling or sentiment you'll have as you receive this information is that we must do something, and understand that you, by attending this meeting and by attaining this information, you're doing a lot. And it has shown through our data and research, which I will touch on here in a little bit, to mitigate risk in a significant way. And so because the Notification Act is the reason we're here talking today, I want to give you a little bit more information on how it works. Because you saw from those numbers I shared with you just a moment ago that not everybody is subject to that broad notification. And so how does that function? For community notification to apply to a registrant, they must cross the threshold of a prison. And so that can be any prison in the state of Minnesota or any prison within the United States, to include U.S. territories. That also includes all federal prisons and military prisons. And so ultimately, and I don't want to forget to mention also, notification and risk level assessment assignment is also performed on those registered individuals who are civilly committed. And so that's kind of your group. So ultimately, this leaves out those registered persons who do not go to prison, who receive a stayed or probationary sentence. If you've ever heard the terms probation and parole used interchangeably, know that probation focuses on pre-prison incarceration, and parole, or in Minnesota, as we call it, supervised release, focuses on post-prison incarceration. And so for those on probation and those with juvenile adjudications, they are not subject to risk level assessment or assignment, and they are that designated group of no level assigned. This does not imply, nor should it be taken to mean, that they are low risk. It simply means that they have not had their risk assessed or assigned. And again, just another example of why broad awareness is so very important when we approach this important topic. Other information I want to share with you about how the Notification Act works is in its breakdown of tasks and duties assigned. So the way that the legislature structured it was that the Department of Corrections, once the individual crossed that threshold, would assess and assign that risk in the risk assessment unit. And so that is exactly what is done. So about 90 days prior to release or earlier, our End of Confinement Review Committee, or ECRC, convenes and goes through a robust amount of data that they can attain on the individual. And that's everything they can get their hands on, from index reports from law enforcement to criminal complaints to treatment summaries and psychosexual assessments or evaluations to collateral reports from community members or loved ones within this individual's life, to get as good a snapshot of what's going on in their life as absolutely possible. And then that's culminated with a full-on interview, forensic interview by one of our psychologists with the individual. And then all of that information is then put into our risk assessment tool known as the MinSOST, the Minnesota Sex Offender Screening Tool. Now, it's important to understand a little bit about this tool, just simply because it is what designates the risk level that's going to be assigned of 1, 2, or 3. And so the MinSOST is normed off of a couple different studies that occurred right here in Minnesota. The first study began in the early 90s when the registration law was coming online, and concluded in the early 2000s, where it followed over 3,166 known adult male sex offenders into the community after they were released from prison. And it tracked them over that period of time. And then there was a follow-up study that was a 4-year track that concluded in 2012 that followed another 2,000 plus known sex offenders. So we have well over 5,000 known adult male sex offenders in this data set. And what the researchers did is they looked at all of their successes and their failures. And those failures, those recidivistic behaviors and tendencies became those normed predictive risk factors that this tool utilizes today. So when I speak to you about a level 1 individual, know that what I'm really saying is that they show a lower amount of those known predictive risk factors as compared to that peer group from the study. A level 2 has a moderate amount of known predictive risk factors, and a level 3 has a higher amount of known predictive risk factors. Now, important things to keep in mind as you're thinking about risk assessment tools is that while they are very useful to assist law enforcement and corrections in applying their resources most effectively to mitigate that risk, the one thing they cannot do is predict the future. And another thing to keep in mind about risk is that it is dynamic. Risk is constantly fluctuating and changing. And so a risk level 1 individual today, if they are not abiding by those expectations of the community, if they are showing those patterned or predatory pre-offense behaviors, and that's being noted by law enforcement or corrections or both, or treatment, they may find that their risk is reassessed and may go up. Just the same as a level 3 designee today may find that if they've shown a pattern of lengthy adherence to those mitigating strategies, that they get reassessed and their risk goes down. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So once a risk level is assessed and assigned, the handoff then goes to our partners in law enforcement. And law enforcement is tasked by the Notification Act to provide notice to their community within the scope of that risk level assigned. So for a level 1 designee, law enforcement is able to provide notification to other law enforcement agencies or correctional agencies. They can provide notification or shall provide notification to victims of or witnesses to the offense if those victims have requested notification, this enhanced level of notification. Not all victims wish to be communicated to about the person that committed the harm. And then you see here also law enforcement will notify immediate adult household members that reside in the home, in that domicile with that level 1 designee. And that is the scope of a level 1 notification. Now, a level 2 notification builds on that group that we just discussed, those individuals and entities, and includes additional individuals or entities that law enforcement determines to be at particular risk based on that registrant's known patterns of conduct and behavior. Now, what's commonly believed with a level 2 notification is that law enforcement's going to notify schools, daycares, churches, libraries, places where children congregate. And while that very well may be the case, it's not always the situation. So take, for example, a level 2 that comes into a community and law enforcement's made aware of their entrance into the community. And they determine after they receive that dossier of information from the risk assessment unit that this person focuses their patterns of conduct and behavior on adult females at bars, roof and all type situations, or whatever, right? And in that scenario, law enforcement may determine it is prudent to notify the proprietors of the various bar establishments in their community of this person so that they can alert their security staff to keep an eye out, etc., as opposed to the local daycare that serves children from infancy to school age and cause alarm where it's not warranted or helpful. On the flip side of that, with a level 2, let's say this individual comes into the community and law enforcement determines with them that they do focus their conduct and behavior on unaccompanied minors, think teens, in transition from school to after-school programming or home. And law enforcement knows that within their community, there is a teen hangout spot that is very popular where these kids will gather and congregate in their downtime. And in that scenario, law enforcement very well may go to the proprietor of that location and say, hey, this level 2 individual, if you see them around, engaging in contact with the kids around here, let us know. We're going to come out and talk to them and find out more about what they may be up to. And so that's the nuance of a level 2 notification. And then with a level 3 notification, this is our broad public notification, and law enforcement will provide information much more openly to all within the community. And that comes in a variety of different formats and styles, because it really comes down to how law enforcement communicates best with its community. At the very end of the day, what you can always expect on a public notification is for the Department of Corrections public registrant search tool to be updated with that individual's information. And from there, it's just very much value added as in the ways that law enforcement shares this to get the information out as broadly as possible. I want to just shift gears now and talk a little bit about the data that has been collected over the research that we've done here in Minnesota and a little bit more broadly throughout the nation, so that you can use this information as you get more on this individual and apply it effectively into those family and community safety planning efforts. So where I like to begin with the data is really with that narrowest end of the funnel. And that's those individuals that have crossed the threshold and are now preparing to re-enter the community. And while the number of individuals does fluctuate and change year after year, the breakdowns of risk levels assigned tends to stay fairly static, to the point where we can say confidently that on average, the majority of risk levels assigned, again, year after year, are those of levels 1 and 2. Around 15% are those designated as level 3. And you saw that kind of represented from that slide I had earlier with all the numbers. It's a much lower percentage of those known registrants. We have over 18,000. And you'll see here in a moment, we're going to be talking about 400 or so. And so again, just another real emphasis on broad awareness and how important that really is. But know that the information we get to share about that 15% is information that can be applied much more broadly, because the methods and means and ways in which they gain trust and violate that trust are very much more applicable across the board, and hopefully can serve to augment your existing safety planning. So I just mentioned the number. I snapped this snapshot just the other day. And this number, again, is just like the registry does fluctuate and change. But if you were to go on to the Department of Corrections website today and go to the search tool and go to the public registrant search function, and had you done that the same day I did it here on the 21st and said, show them all to me, you would have seen 446. So again, remember, out of those 18,000 some, 446 are subject to that broad public notification. Those are the folks we get to have these broader conversations about. Of that group, 14 at the time were out of compliance and need to be brought back into compliance with the registry and with all of their requirements. And so it's important to know them as well, so that should you encounter somebody who's out of compliance, you can certainly notify law enforcement, and they will be eager to get these individuals back into compliance with our registry. So again, broad awareness is just very important. Other data that I want to share with you that I think is really helpful as you're formulating those family safety plans is to understand the breakdowns of the relationships between those who engage in this type of harm and the people they hurt. Now, this data is actually pulled from the U.S. Department of Justice research, but it mirrors what we found here in our Minnesota data set as well. And as you can see, the majority of those engaging in this type of harm are known to the victims. They have a relationship that they've built of trust or been granted of trust, and exploit that access that they're given. About 7%, as you can see here, fall into that stranger category. Now, no doubt as you're thinking about this data and you're contemplating in your minds, you're thinking, Brad, I have a lot of control over those in my life, in my family. I can set boundaries where and when they're appropriate and necessary. And I even have a lot of control over those who get to build relationships of trust as acquaintances with my loved ones. But the group that gives us the most pause, as it should, is that stranger category. This is the group we do not have direct influence or control over. So it's important to understand some of the limitations of research studies like this. Assessors and researchers had to create a cutoff on what is considered a knowing, an acquaintanceship, and they did just that. And that determination was 24 hours. if they could not show through all the information available to them that there was a knowing between the perpetrator and the victim of 24 hours or greater, then they would fall into that stranger category. Now, it's important to understand that that would include situations like this, where two teens are meeting up at a local house party and they don't know each other. They went to different schools and the night's going the way it's going and they've hit it off. And they decide to leave the group to an isolated location within the home or out of the home or whatever. And the night takes an awful turn. Now, this would fall into that stranger group. But what we tend to think of more as parents, as concerned community members, when we think of that stranger category, is that group that is just beyond our awareness, just outside of our consciousness, that is acting on ill intent with a mean to do harm. That group falls into a much smaller percentile of about 3% on average. Now that is cold comfort without a doubt. But what I want for you to do when you're looking at this information is to understand that the much more likely scenario is somebody who has created a relationship of trust and is exploiting that access. That 3% group, while alarming and jarring, is out there and does exist. The majority are going to be those who are exploiting those relationships. So do just keep that in mind as you're formulating how you want to speak to your children and your community about this information after you've gotten some more from me here. One more piece of data that I want to share with you, and I think this one's is equally as important, if not the more important, is the age breakdowns of those harmed. Now, we're back to that Minnesota research study, the one that concluded most recently in 2012. And you can see here that our age breakdowns is in thirds. But very quickly, you're going to see those age ranges over here on the right. And you're going to see that 2/3 of those harmed are children. And then you're really going to start to look at those age breakdowns, and you're going to see that that narrowest age range up here, that 13 to 17 range, constitutes 33% of those that are harmed. That's 9% of our population and worthy of some more thought and unpacking what is going on here. So what we know from all of that research and information that we have available is that those children in those early years are still very much under the watchful, caring gaze of their trusted adult support networks. And so we as agencies want to make sure that those trusted adults have all the tools available to vet the people coming into those kids' lives, to ensure that we're putting the right people in positions of authority and trust with our kids. But what ends up happening when we get into those teenage years is the very thing that we as communities strive to achieve, which is a place where our kids can go out and explore and express their autonomy. And they deserve every bit of that. But the issue is that now that they're out there formulating relationships on their own outside of that careful, watchful gaze, is that there's a potential for somebody to exploit that trust. And so this is why this group is more vulnerable. And so what we've learned over the years is we've gotten away from that older, probably more familiar model of the talk, where we as parents would pull our teen aside at that critical age and pull back the veil just enough to show them that the world is not as safe as it had been made to be for them when they were younger. But what we found with that method really was that we got one of two distinct reactions from our kids. One would be either just full-on denial or rebuke. Mom, Dad, you're overreacting. My friends are fine. Everything's okay. All the way to the other side of that spectrum, where we would have our kids become so fearful that they would withdraw from the very things that they'd grown to love in their lives. And neither reaction is what we seek from our kids. So what we've learned is that we really have kind of modeled it now into a form of a bunch of little talks, age appropriate in their design, that grow with the child from those early ages all the way up on into those formative teenage years, so that by the time our kids hit those teen years, they have a readily available toolbox of skills to help them as they're assessing those who are going to be safe and allowed access and those who are not. And so I certainly not the subject matter in this expert or in this field, but I will provide you some information on those who are. But the bottom line is that with those talks, the one thing we want to ensure is that our kids are not fearful, because we know that scared kids do not equal safe kids. But we also need our kids to understand that nice people do not always equal safe people. And so again, I will share with you some more information here as I get into it, so that you can augment your skills and your tools to have those important conversations. But now I want to shift gears and get into the information about the man you're here to learn about today. Use all the stuff I've shared with you so far as that overlay and see where things from our data align and where they may depart. This is Henry Jackson. First, I want to speak about photographs. Photographs are updated on average of annually, or should the individual change their appearance in a significant way. So you can always expect that for the duration of his time on the registry, for as long as he has that level 3 designation, you will always have an accurate photograph of what he looks like. These are Mr. Jackson's vitals. He is currently 63 years of age and is residing at the 4300 block of Welcome Avenue North in Crystal. Now, I want to take a moment and address a question that often comes up in meetings like this. And that question is Brad, will you tell us where he lives? It would give us a great deal of comfort if we knew where his head hit the pillow at night. And the answer is, in part, you'll recall, I don't know if I mentioned it entirely, but I will say now, is that the registry run by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is designated as private information and is only therefore for law enforcement and correctional purposes. But we attain a lot with a proximal address, because no doubt that those who live within this area will become aware of Mr. Jackson if they're not already, as they see him come and go in his day-to-day activities. And that information will be shared amongst these neighbors, and that's just fine. But what we do not want as agencies is for this information to proliferate more broadly to a point where somebody from well outside of the Crystal community who has a vendetta, who is out to express some vigilante justice, comes in and exacts some revenge scenario that does nothing to restore a victim and does nothing to mitigate risk, and only serves to disrupt the very things you've worked so hard to achieve here within your community. And so that is why we utilize the proximal addresses. This is Mr. Jackson's registrable offense history. This is not an exhaustive criminal history. If you are interested in his criminal history, you most certainly can access that. It is available to you. You can go onto the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's website and go to their public criminal history search tool, where you'll enter in his name and date of birth, which you have here from this information, and you will see his full criminal history. But because the Notification Act focuses on those patterns of conduct and behavior that placed him onto the registry and resulted in his risk level assignment, we're going to focus on those specific incidences. So this is taken, this verbiage here, this is taken directly from the fact sheet that you have available to you already. So I'm going to get right into the details about what happened. In 2008, Mr. Jackson was convicted for two separate counts, or two separate charges of criminal sexual conduct in the third degree out of Hennepin County, both stemming from conduct that occurred in 2007 during the month of August. These are in order of conviction, but out of order in relation to occurrence. So this is actually victim 2. So victim 2 became known to law enforcement. She was a 54-year-old female. She did not know who Mr. Jackson was prior to their encounter, and so would fall into that stranger category. They had met at a local convenience store. They struck up a friendly conversation, and he invited her to an adjacent location to have some drinks with him. And she agreed. And so she left with him to that location, consumed alcohol with him, and ended up falling asleep. She woke to the assault, and he managed to maintain that control through force and threats of violence. Once the victim was able to make this report to law enforcement, they were able to identify Mr. Jackson, take him into custody, and for this crime, he received a 57-month commitment to the Commissioner of Corrections. Now, there's a couple layers of things going on here, and I want to speak first to one of the other big questions that comes up in meetings like this, and that is, Brad, why is it that someone who engages in this kind of harm, that they're ever allowed to return into society only to potentially do it again? And that answer lies here in part due to determinate sentencing. So in Minnesota, back in the 80s, we went away from that more familiar parole system to what's called a determinate sentencing model. That parole system, what it is, just for those who may not be familiar, is where a incarcerated person in the prison system comes before a panel or a board at a designated amount of time that they've served in the facility, and they are eligible to serve the remainder of their time in the community on parole under certain terms and conditions. And what we found with this system was that those who engaged in shocking behavior such as this found it particularly difficult to be granted parole. Now, thinking on that, you're no doubt going to be thinking, Brad, that's just fine. This individual has earned every day that they have come into them, and they can sit that entirety. But what we found from all of the data and research that we've done from that point on is that that model resulted in these individuals sitting in the institution languishing for that duration, only to be released at that expiration date. And I want to point out that well over 90% of our incarcerated population today will come out. They will reenter society. And these folks would be walked to the gates and told, don't come back. And with our recidivism research, that reoffending in a same or similar fashion or behavior showed that this method was ineffective. Our recidivism rates were at a level that no one was pleased with, and we all knew we could do better. So with the determinate sentencing model, what we've done is we've set structured guidelines formed by the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission, on which every year on their board sits a victim of a violent person crime, to determine those durations that are going to be preset for the various crimes enumerated in state law. And for this crime and this severity level, the determination by that Sentencing Guidelines Commission is 57 months. Now, with determinate sentencing, 2/3 of that time will be served in prison if they go to prison. If that stay is vacated and the sentence is executed, they will serve 2/3 in the prison, and 1/3 will be served on supervised release. Now, in Minnesota, we found that some individuals who maybe didn't want to engage in treatment would execute their sentences intentionally to serve their time and be off supervision within a known period of time. And we wanted that opportunity to continue to work with them as they re-entered, because re-entry time is the most critical. And so we added an enhancer to state law. So not only is there a 57-month commit here, you'll see there's a 10-year conditional release period. This extends that final third, no matter what it would be, to a full decade, to work with a corrections agent as they re-enter on supervised release or intensive supervised release. And so you see the commitment term, the enhanced sentence, and then you see stayed for 5 years. This tells you that it was a probationary case out of the gate. So in 2008, when he was sentenced for this crime, he had that duration, that 57 months with that 10-year conditional hanging over his head, and was told, follow these terms and conditions, abide by these rules, and you can remain in the community. Now, you'll see here that in May of 2009, the court vacated that stay and did commit him to the Commissioner of Corrections, and therefore he did cross that threshold. And I'll give you some more detail on that coming up. Okay, so that's a snapshot into the determinate sentencing model and the why they come out. And it hopefully helps to kind of really lay the groundwork for the work they're doing in the institution to address the behavior that brought them in the first place through treatment, counseling, therapy, and so on, then gets transitioned in a warm handoff to the supervision agent, where they get to continue to work on those skills to mitigate risk, to engage in healthy, adaptive lifestyle building, so that when that true expiration date does come, and remember, it will come, that they've internalized those mitigation behaviors and strategies and go on to lead a quiet existence. Okay, so I had mentioned that this is kind of out of order. This is victim 2, sentence 1. So once they had caught Mr. Jackson, they took his DNA, and that DNA was ran against a database, and it pinged on another victim that had been assaulted just days earlier to victim 2 here. And so that is here our second conviction. So again, occurred in 2007 during that month of August. Victim 1, sentence 2, we don't know her age, we just know adult female. Again, not known to Mr. Jackson. He accessed his victim while she was walking around somewhere between 4 and 6 a.m. toward a encampment that she resided at. He came up behind her, covered her mouth and nose, and threatened her with violence in order to gain and take control, and then moved her into an isolated stairwell in an adjacent building. He was then later identified, as I mentioned, through his DNA. After the victim came to law enforcement, they collected that DNA, and we were able to connect him to this crime. Now, for this crime, because it comes as the second conviction, it gets enhanced because he has that prior third CSC 3. And so now it's a 90-month commit. And you can see this kind of escalation in time, again, with that 10-year conditional release period, and run concurrently with that first file for that 5-year term of supervision. So now he's on supervision for 2 files. This becomes his governing file. And again, you can see here in 2009, the court vacated the stay on both these and committed him to the Commissioner of Corrections. So that 90-month term is the dominant or the governing file. It's the longest amount of time, as they are run concurrently, not consecutively. So here's his prison chronology as it breaks down. May of 2009, as we talked about here, he enters prison for both of those CSC 3s. And he is assessed and assigned a risk level of 3 at that time by the End of Confinement Review Committee. And he is released at that 2/3 point into the community on 4/15/2013. Now, for my number crunchers, you're going 2/3 of 90 is not met here, Brad. I just want to point out that credit is given for time served from the date of offense forward. So he would have gotten credit on all files up to the date of offense for each. And that counts for county time as well, books and release. Any kind of book and release is a day credit, and so on. So just know that there's a credit factor involved. All right. So Mr. Jackson had been in and out with revocations a number of times for technical violations and for new non-sex specific criminal conduct. And that's important to point out, is that doesn't trigger that recidivistic sex offense side, which is what we are most concerned about. But he continued to struggle with chemical dependency and behavior issues. Most recent revocation was in February of 2020. Again, technical violations, not new criminal conduct. And re-released at his most recent time here now in August of 2020. And he's been in our community since that date and has been meeting his expectations with his supervision agent, and moved here to the city of Crystal this month, made that move. And so I want to talk now a little bit about how supervision is set up for this individual. Just to give you some time frames, you can see here, Mr. Jackson will be under this correctional supervision until 2023. He expires in the end of July of this year. And once he's off supervision, his rights will be restored to him, and he will be allowed to, basically have all of his liberties returned, with the exception of his requirement to register. He is subject to the registry for life. And for as long as he retains that risk level of 3, he will be subject to broad public notification. So just so you have that awareness. So the agent will have a limited amount of time to continue working with him. But at this point, there's a strong indication that he has internalized those behaviors that are going to mitigate that risk of sexual reoffending. He's on intensive supervised release, as are all level 3 designees. It's a mandate. Intensive supervision is actually one of those pillars of that broader state risk management system, and actually came online even before the registry. And what this does is it sets by law the amount of individuals that can be on supervision to any one corrections agent. And that amount is set to 15. No ISR agent or intensive supervised release agent can maintain a caseload of more than 15 clients. And there can be no fewer than 2 ISR agents assigned to a caseload of intensive supervisees as they operate 24/7. And so this has shown a great deal of efficiency and effectiveness at addressing and mitigating those known predictive risk factors. We've learned through all that research, for example, that the first 4 years of release, initial release, the first 4 years of initial release are the most demanding from law enforcement and supervision aspects to ensure that all of those skills are really being put in place and maintained. Once they've hit that 4-year mark, we see a precipitous decline in recidivistic tendencies and conduct. And so anyway, ISR is kind of built and formulated on that knowledge. They work very much in collaboration with the institutional staff, as we've kind of talked about already, to ensure that warm handoff. All the work and treatment and programming that they've been doing in the institution is then continued into the community to ensure that the aftercare phases, any medication changes, are all stable, and ensure that quiet existence is much more likely to be achieved. They do utilize GPS monitoring as one of their tools, and that can be applied and removed and reapplied if needed, and can really help to establish structure in the lives of those that are coming out onto this type of supervision, and serves as a tool. Really, the ultimate goal, as you've heard me talk about, is that successful reentry. We know that we have a limited amount of time to work with these individuals, and we want to ensure that those inhibitors, those mitigating behaviors, are internalized so that they go on to lead that quiet existence. And we've become quite successful at doing just that. ISR, as I mentioned, operates just like law enforcement, 24/7, 365. It's very highly structured and regimented. We talked about the reduced caseload size. There are mandates on face-to-face contact. They will be seen face-to-face multiple times during any given 7-day period. They will have daily telephone contacts. They must provide their schedules to their agents and not deviate from their schedules unless it's an emergency. And we're talking like something happened in my building, caught on fire, and now I got to stand out in the street, kind of an emergency, or I'm on my way to the emergency room. They cannot deviate and say, I'm going to not go to work today and instead I'm going to go to the ball game. That would be a violation of their conditions of release. Any kind of community activity must be approved prior to the engagement in that activity by their agent. This is the assigned agent working directly with this individual. Again, John's going to be, engaging with him up and through that expiration date of July, but he's certainly there as a resource. If you have questions about supervision, about ISR, he can definitely help fill in any answers with that regard. So certainly take a snapshot of this photo or of this screen so that you have that number available should you need it. It's also on the fact sheet that you've been provided. As you're thinking about other resources, as now you're taking on all of this information, and it is like drinking from a fire hose, I know. But I just want to make sure you know who to call when and if you have questions about any of this information as I've been rattling it off here. And so we have your ISR contact, and we also have your best and most direct resource, and that is your local law enforcement. The Crystal Police Department, as you know, has been dealing with this population since the 90s when we started identifying them as unique in group, and has well-versed in all the things that come along with managing this population. And they are your best and most direct contact. If you see this individual engaging in conduct or behavior that raises your concern, call 911. But as your awareness has been broadened, if you see anybody acting in a way that just doesn't seem right or raises the hair on the back of your neck, I want you reaching out to local law enforcement and making sure that information is shared with them, because they can then go to that registry and use that tool, because remember, they know way more than we get to know on this side. And so then they can apply those tools to ensure that folks are in compliance, and that if there's anybody engaging in risky behavior, it's being dealt with immediately. If you have just general questions about how your agency polices this unique population, certainly call their non-emergency number, and they'll be happy to provide you with some additional information as well. From the family safety planning side, as you've been thinking about how you want to maybe have those age appropriate conversations with your children or children that you care for, I highly recommend as one of your resources being the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. They are genuinely the subject matter experts and have a great deal of content available on their website, and will even come out and provide workshops and talk to children at schools and adults, your community groups, whatever the case may be. And I just can't strongly encourage you enough to reach out to them with any questions you may have about how to talk to your kids or how to build or augment your safety plans. In addition to the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, knowing what we know about this type of information is that somebody reviewing this video is going to likely have been impacted by this type of harm, either directly or have supported somebody who's encountered or had this type of harm. And conversations like this, no matter how hard we try, have a way of stirring up that old wound. And if you find that someone you know or care for or yourself has been triggered by this information, we want to make sure you have your local victim services provider readily available to you to share with those who may need it or to utilize yourself. If you feel that this has caused you to have difficulty feeling safe in your own home or within your community, and you are looking for additional resources outside of law enforcement and your immediate support network, certainly consider reaching out to the Sexual Violence Center or other services. Hennepin County has a great deal of services available. This is just one. So do have them in mind. Lastly, as far as resources go, and again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are some great places to go if you're looking to augment your information further. Don't let this video be the only bit of information you receive on this important topic. There is a lot out there. Take your time to really go through and find the information that's going to be most helpful for you as you build those safety plans. Lastly, I spoke about the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's website and that public criminal history search tool. They also have a tool there for non-compliant registrants, any of them, if they're adults and they've gone out of compliance for a period of time, their information is made available on that site as well. And then the Department of Corrections website, as we've discussed, where you can find our public registrant search tool. You can find all of the publications and data that I've referenced here today in my PowerPoint in its pure form. And I encourage you to read through that and draw your own conclusions. And we also maintain the the search locator for anybody under the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections. So that can be a valuable tool as well. As I leave you today, I want to kind of wrap things up into the 390s and the 2 R's. If you've taken nothing else away from all that I've thrown at you, please let it be this, that from what we know, from all of our data and research, is that 90% of those, in fact, even better, that once they've become known to the system and gone through that full array of that risk management, all those various components, 90% do not go on to reoffend sexually. Of those that do engage in this harm, 90% of them are known to their victims and utilize that relationship of trust to engage in that harm. The last 90 is kind of the inverse of the first, is that if I were to take all 18,000 plus registered individuals today and put them on the moon, I would have impacted sexual harm in Minnesota by no better than 10%. 90% of crimes engaged in year after year in the state of Minnesota are perpetrated by those who the system has not identified as a sex offender. And so that broad awareness is just so very critical. And the 2 R's, what we've learned from our data is that where a registered person lives, where they are geographically located at any given time, is not predictive of risk. Social proximity is predictive, where they can build those relationships of trust and be granted that access, where they can become isolated. That is where risk lies. And so do remember this as you're thinking about the broadness of this topic, because a housed registered individual is a lower risk than a unhoused homeless registered individual. And so this is an important component to keep in mind. As you heard Deputy Chief Hubbard mention at the beginning, because of this format, we're not able to do live Q&A, but please do reach out with your questions, whether you're calling John with Hennepin County for supervision questions, you're calling Allison Fay with Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, or you're calling Deputy Chief Hubbard or myself. Please do reach out. We are accessible and available to you and really want to assist you as you're working to understand and get your mind around all of this information. I want to thank you again for taking your time to review this with me, and thank the Crystal Police Department and the City of Crystal for all of its work to get this information out to as many folks as possible. Thank you and take care.
Brad, thanks so much for taking time to share the information with us. A couple other things that I might just point out as folks are watching in terms of some resources. Brad gave some great resources for information and knowledge. A couple closer to home resources that I just want to make sure that our community is aware exist. We do have some embedded staff here in the police department that are not our employees, but they work with us. We have a Hennepin County social worker that is with us that can be available to help navigate situations, crisis situations, chemical dependency issues that people may be having. And we also have a partnership with Tubman Alliance, where we have some advocates that are housed here to assist with domestic violence situations, sexual violence, sexual exploitation situations. And so some really close to home resources as well that team would be happy to come alongside of you. And then I guess the last thing I would just add to Brad's presentation is, we always try to figure out how we present this information to the community. We want to make sure that people have the information that they should have so that they can plan, that they can be safe. We also want to keep, we want to keep the whole community safe. We want to keep this person who's now moved into our community safe as well. And so that's how we try to measure how best to do this. One of the things that I found in my work, not just in this area, but in general, is that where we sometimes find ourselves with problems is we find ourselves in the middle of what I call the rumor hamster wheel. And so we hear something, or something gets posted on social media, or something's on Nextdoor, and we believe that to be true. We believe that to be a true factual gospel statement. And then it takes legs and it just starts spinning around and kind of gets out of control. And so in situations like this, or any situation of anything that you might hear about, I would much rather that you reach out to us and, hey, I heard about this, or this, I believe this is occurring because somebody told me that. We pride ourselves here on not trying to hide any information. We try to be a lot of people say they're transparent. We really do try to do that. So if you hear something that's concerning in the community, you hear a rumor about something that happened about this individual or anything in general, please feel free to reach out, give myself a call, give any of the other individuals, give Brad a call. It's much easier to come in front of it and give the real information and make sure people have that than just to kind of leave it to chance and assume what we're seeing is true. So again, I'll echo thanks to everybody who took the time to educate yourselves better and know a little bit more about this situation. And again, I'll just encourage you to reach out with any questions or concerns that you might have. So thank you very much.